Welcome to another exciting episode of the DevLogue podcast, where we dive deep into everything related to software development. Our focus is on learning and exploring how to improve our development processes, particularly through leveraging AI and data-driven strategies. I'm your host, Henry. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Anmol. How are you doing, Anmol?
Henry, I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for yet another episode of the DevLogue podcast.
Fantastic. Today, we have a special guest joining us all the way from the other side of the world in Australia. Hugh Powell, Principal Software Engineer at Qantas Hotels and Holidays, is with us. Hugh and I connected through the Apache DevLogue open source community. And in our community, continuous delivery is a goal that many engineering teams strive for. Many teams adopt engineering frameworks like DORA and tools like DevLogue to guide them through the process. But Hugh's team is already deployed code 10 to 12 times a day, so which is incredibly impressive and a testament to their mastery of continuous delivery. So hopefully through today's discussion, we can learn how to achieve such high frequency deployments, understand the challenges involved, and explore strategies to overcome them. Hugh, it's great to have you here. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself and what your current CI/CD processes are like?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Henry and Anmol. Thanks for having me on. I think it's going to be fun. My name's Hugh. I'm a principal software engineer. Yeah, and so I've been doing software since forever. I played computer games as a kid, was quite good at maths, decided I would then go and study computer science at university, then went and got a dev job, have been doing dev stuff ever since. I'm currently working for Qantas in their hotels and holidays division. So that's part of their loyalty group. So the loyalty is all about kind of earning points and burning points, like it's a loyalty program. And so we fit in with the hotels and holidays side of that. We don't actually own any hotels or holidays. You just get to use your points or burn your points when you book through us. Yeah, so we started originally as the hotels and holidays division was originally a white label company. I think they started around 2012. So I've only been here for 2.5 years. So apologies to anyone from Hotels and Holidays who is watching this and I get this history wrong. Yeah, so the company started in 2012. I think they launched their first product around 2016. And they white labeled and were being used by parts of the Qantas group. They were then acquired by the Qantas group around 2017, 2018. And so I think we have a bit of a weird story when it comes to our history of kind of continuous delivery in that we haven't ever had to really get there. We kind of started there as far as I can tell. So certainly when I joined kind of 2.5 years ago, we had, you commit to, you make your commit, you raise your PR gets merged and that goes straight out to production, which to me was crazy. Like I'd never worked in such an amazing environment, but also really scary. Because, sometimes as a dev, you get a bit lazy and it's like, I'm going to push it, I'm going to write this code. I'm not too sure about it. Somebody will catch it in the PR. And if it doesn't get caught in the PR, it will get caught in the post PR testing. Whereas that doesn't happen anymore. Like you really do have to be on your game the entire time. That's kind of where we are at the moment. Trying to build on that really.
So that situation is sometimes a really scary, situation for developers, right? You have a pull request, you merge it to main branch, and then it goes directly to production. So how do you guys ensure the quality of your code base, your pull requests, and then is there anywhere the QA person involved? How do you ensure the quality of your test suite?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when you go to continuous delivery, you kind of need a multi-pronged strategy. There's not just one thing, like you do this one thing and then you can do continuous delivery or continuous deployment. So we have a few strategies. So one of them is generally trying to work with small commits and small PRs. That limits the blast radius of anything you can break. Like obviously, there is always the one character change that brings down your entire site. But if it is only that one character, it's much more likely to be caught during the PR process. We do also have dedicated QE engineers, and so we try and involve them as early as possible in the development process. So rather than having them act as gatekeepers, the developers are working with them upfront as projects or initiatives are being kicked off. And so they ensure that the testing we're doing is of a suitable quality and, help us maintain the quality of our automated test suites. And also for the more complicated stuff, we will just deploy to a staging environment, and then the QEs can run additional tests at that point.
So
And
Hugh, I gotta ask you, right? So congratulations, by the way, on your guys' achievement from a deployment frequency perspective. So most of the organizations we talk to are working hard to get to where you're already at, right? I mean, they're deploying maybe once a week or less than once a week, and they're using DORA and metrics in order to shed some light on efficiencies to get to the point where you guys are at, which is deploying many times a day, right? I know when you started 2.5 years ago, you guys are kind of already there, right? It was unlike any organization you had ever seen. Any feedback on how they got there? Any history on how they got to such a high deployment frequency that you could share?
Yeah, so unfortunately, to some extent, as far as I can tell, they just started that way. The folk who built the engineering leads of the organization originally were just like, we know how to build software properly. Obviously they have a much easier time of it, right? They don't have 100 years worth of history of of organizational history to deal with. There's not all that tech debt. As far as I can tell, they just knew what they wanted to do and had enough leeway inside the rest of what was presumably quite a small organization to be like, we're just going to do this the way we think it should be done. Which unfortunately isn't very helpful for a lot of your viewers.
So one question I have, following your point, how QA engineer works together with developers, is how do QA engineers divide the responsibility with developers? How much task is written by developers versus how much task is done by QA engineer?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it depends on the team and on the work that's being done. And also, the developer and the QE, right? So if you've got a fairly junior engineer, then the QE will spend more time with them at a lower level to making sure that their unit tests are being written in a maintainable way and creating sufficient coverage and that sort of thing. Whereas, you have more experienced engineers, then they need less help with that sort of thing. And also the complexity of the change that's being made. Is this a greenfield thing? Is this a greenfield thing, and therefore really all we need to worry about at a higher level is what do we want? Or is it kind of working on essentially a brownfield site that maybe doesn't have the greatest test coverage in the world, and some of it we're not entirely sure what it does. So often we'll work with QEs to essentially write the test plan up front that we're going to want to run afterwards, and be like, cool, where are we? What is broken? What do we know and what do we not know? And then once you get to the end of the project, you can be like, okay, cool, this thing's broken, but it was already broken. So yeah, we can put it in the backlog and get it fixed, but it's not going to stop this being released.
Makes sense. So Hugh, can you tell us a bit more about how much of your test suite is automated? Because when we ship a new feature to production, we not only test this feature, but also make sure there's no regression on our larger functionality, right? So many teams found the bottleneck is on the regression test part, because they already have a very large base of functionality that they need to test every time they want to have some new feature. So how much of your test suite is automated? How do you tackle this challenge?
So I think to some extent it's 100% automated. So it's absolutely possible for a developer to make a change, a small enough change, and not have QE review it and be confident that that's happening. In a lot of our code base, obviously there's some of the code base that isn't as well tested, and then generally the strategy is to create that regression test suite. And so I think that's that, again, it's a really lucky place to be for us. We've always had this culture of, because we're pushing to production on a regular basis, you need a high quality test suite. It's not perfect. Sometimes stuff does get into production that breaks. We're able to, so again, because we're pushing regularly, we were able to quickly fix that. So obviously that there are some downsides to that, in that sometimes if you're not careful, especially if you're doing end-to-end testing, if you're not careful, your build times can kind of massively explode, and you end up waiting kind of an hour, 2 hours for your builds to go to production. And so yeah, we tend to go through phases of the time it takes to deploy expands, and then it gets to a critical point, and we realize, and we work on
Yeah.
it to get it back down again.
So how long does it take to run your entire automated test suite right now in your pipeline?
Interesting. Right. So we don't have the concept of an entire automated test suite. Like each repo has its own test suites. So we have microservice architecture. Each service has its own repository. Generally, there are some teams are doing mono repos or starting to do mono repos. That's a whole other conversation. But yeah, so, and because we're quite strict about forwards and backwards compatibility of our APIs, generally, if you want to do end-to-end testing, that testing happens against our staging environment. So there's no concept of we're going to run every test for our entire platform.
Makes sense. And then you guys are building a web app, right?
Yeah.
Is it a web app?
I mean, yes.
Okay. Yeah. And then do you guys have like Selenium task that covers all the different user app interaction?
Interesting. So I'm actually I tend to work with the back-end teams. I'm not fully across how that testing works in the front end, unfortunately.
Cool. Maybe next time we'll bring out some front end of our team. Because one thing that we heard from many engineering teams is the Selenium tests are really flaky on the front end side, especially when your product is quickly evolving. And it's really hard to have a comprehensive test suite that's up to date with your front end.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had, because I think TDD to some extent suffers from this as well, in that when you're writing those fine-grained tests, you're making this trade-off between, we expect this thing to be stable kind of in the long term, so we're going to increase the cost of changing it, but with the benefit of, if it changes accidentally, we want to know about it. And I think there's definitely some skill to writing tests that I mean, really talk to QEs about this sort of thing. But I think there's definitely a skill here about writing regression tests, especially regression tests, that are only checking for the things that we expect to remain stable for a long time, for a reasonably long time, or that we're willing to take the cost of when we do want to change these things. I'm still working out where this balance is, and I suspect it's very different for different companies at different stages of evolutions, for different services at different stages of evolution. And so I mentioned TDD, and I'm not sure it's TDD's fault necessarily. It might just be a lack of kind of the third refactoring step of TDD, which sometimes I feel doesn't necessarily happen. But yeah, definitely there's some nuance to testing that I think often gets lost.
Really interesting.
And then Hugh, talk to us a little bit, if you can, about just metrics and DORA, right? Obviously, we connected through Apache DevLake. Most of the users that we talk to, they're calculating DORA metrics or metrics in general in order to go faster, increase deployment frequency, et cetera, et cetera. You guys are already going very fast. So what was your interest in DORA and metrics and DevLake? Talk to us a little bit about that, if you could.
Yeah. So we kind of have this, I don't want to say this. So obviously this culture has been built in this organization for kind of the last 8-10 years, but without any kind of formal underpinnings. Like, I described how, like previously I described how our culture kind of, like, I can't point to anything about why we do these things. We just do. And I recently watched a talk by Dan North that the gist was, the worst thing you can say is, this is the way we do it. And kind of being part of a larger organization now, we're being more and more integrated into their processes, and their processes are different. And so I think what I'm hoping is that DORA will give us the ability to tell our story, kind of with some wider context. It's like, here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it, and here's why it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think a recurrent theme that I hear from users of DORA is not really just a tool for engineering, but it's also a tool for conversation. It's for teams to build alignment across teams and to build a common ground between teams, to have some meaningful conversation and to get aligned on common goals. Can you tell us a bit more about what kind of story you guys are finding from the DORA metrics?
Yeah, so we're right at the beginning of our DORA story. So I'm not sure there's too much I can talk about what we've managed to do with it yet. We're more in the how do we get those metrics? And so I'm just going to go off on a tangent here. What I found really interesting, so I started looking at this kind of 2 years ago. And what I discovered, and this should have been obvious really, because the DORA metrics come from surveys, the definitions of each of the things actually isn't really obvious. And so one of the things I've been working on recently is working with teams to, for themselves, define what each of those metrics and each of the capabilities from the Accelerate book actually mean to them. What does it mean? So what is continuous delivery or continuous deployment? And so what does that mean to us as a team? I tend to like to talk about it at a scale. So what is it if you're not doing it? So if what's the worst that this could be? And so for continuous deployment, it's probably creating an artifact on your own machine, on a developer's machine, SSHing into a server, and doing a manual update. Right, that's as bad as it can get. And what's the best that it can get? Well, every time I commit, it's in production. And so where are we on that scale? And what's the next step to get to that ultimate goal?
And here I want to come back to some of the key components in achieving continuous delivery. So we obviously talk about the testing, reliability, and coverage. That's a key component. I think another key component is really the automation in your CI/CD pipeline, right? So I wonder what specific automation tools and strategies do you guys use? And then have they helped overcome integration challenges to ensure smooth deployments?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a huge amount we do in our pipelines. Like, it's fairly simple. We run all our automated tests. And again, it's on a team by team basis. So I've definitely worked with teams that have linting in their pipeline and code formatting in their pipeline. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I'm not sure the success of continuous deployment rests on the automation in your pipeline. I actually think what's more important is all of the stuff that is traditionally gate kept. So testing and risk and security. And it's all about shifting that away from gatekeeping at kind of the right-hand side of the development cycle to the left-hand side and getting all of that stuff up front. And yeah, I do think that's more important, to be honest. And much harder to do, right? Like it's much easier to throw I don't know, some security processing tool into your pipeline and being like, cool, we've done security. But I think it's a much more useful and much more effective way is to have your security engineers with you at the beginning of a project, being like, cool, how is this going to make your life hard? And can we stop that up front? Like, yeah, I think this is the hard thing about moving to continuous integration is that I think it's much less a technological challenge and much more a social challenge. It's much more, how do we change our processes, not what technology do we use to do this?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess I was referring to more tooling automation in terms of that helps with this shifting left process, right? For example, like making it easy for developers to spin up staging environments, make them easier to task things and validate things. That will help us shift the responsibility, towards the more of the earlier in the process. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, is there what kind of tooling are you guys using in?
Yeah, okay. So we've got a build server. We use BuildKite, which I think is an Australian company that does build tooling. We use Terraform to build all of our artifacts. Yeah, and then we're running on AWS. So if we need more servers, we can have more servers, as long as we don't go too crazy and then somebody with a credit card comes and get very angry with us. But yeah, I mean, I think there's also, it's not massively complicated. It is relatively straightforward. And I think that is also an advantage. Like, it allows us to move relatively quickly. And again, I mean, it does require trust in your teams, right? Like, if you're not having all these sign-offs, then that responsibility has to go somewhere. If you don't have these gates, then that responsibility is being moved into those teams. Yeah.
I think this is a great data point to have, because I think for many people, when they talk about implementing continuous delivery, that sounds like a lot of work and a lot of tooling, automation to set up. But I think from your data point, it seems like sometimes you can implement continuous delivery with 10 to 12 times of delivery a day, but with relatively straightforward pipeline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. One more thing I want to talk about is more on the monitoring and feedback side of things. So how do you approach continuous monitoring of your applications? And then what strategies have proven most effective in providing real-time feedback and ensuring system health when you are doing these many deployments on a daily basis?
Yeah, interesting. So again, like clearly the folk who started this company knew exactly what they were doing. So when I rocked up, so we were using like structured logging, right? So I feel like there's 3 tiers of logging. There's unstructured logging, which is where you just kind of write some text in your log lines, and then there's structured logging, which is you send often JSON data, like structured data, so JSON, for example. And then there's kind of tracing and open telemetry and all that fun sort of stuff. And so when I started, we were doing structured logging, and I think the most useful thing that they'd managed to do was create something called a correlation ID, which would then get passed through the entire system as requests were being made. And so this meant that you could then trace through the system of the root of the request, which was something I hadn't experienced before and made tracking down issues much easier than they had previously. We also collect metrics. We're currently using DataDog for all of that. So we tend to use more of that for resourcing. What does our memory look like? What does our CPU consumption look like? What does our on-disk consumption look like? Kind of those sorts of things, and we just keep an eye on them. I think most teams have alerts set up for if they hit thresholds. So that's where we're currently at. The organization as a whole has done a bunch of investing into open telemetry, which I'm very excited about. So I think that kind of takes it to the next level. I haven't used it a huge amount so far, but do you know who Charity Majors is? So she's the CTO of a company called Honeycomb, and they're building their product all on top of open telemetry. And yeah, I will butcher anything. All I'm doing is really regurgitating what she said. Yeah, so go and find Charity Majors and watch some of the videos she's put out. And yeah, I think the general idea is that with open telemetry, if you can get it embedded into your ecosystem well enough, you end up no longer relying on the person with the longest tenure to fix the bugs, because it makes the ability to understand what's going in your system much easier. So I'm really excited.
Hopefully, we'll have an episode in the future dedicated to open telemetry. But can you give us example here? Like, what kind of telemetry are you guys collecting using open telemetry, and how does it help you understand your application?
So we've only just started with open telemetry, so we're still trying to work out how does it fit into our ecosystem. So we're still very much at the structured logging level of things. And so we're collecting this correlation ID, which goes towards our system, which is great. And then again, it's kind of on a team by team basis. It's like, and essentially, again, it comes down to experience, right? It's like, what has caused us pain before, and what do we need to log, and how do we trade that off against the fact that we can't log everything? So I work with backend teams. Often we're logging headers, and really it's HTTP request headers. Often we'll log summaries because we're at times dealing with vast quantities of data, and so it's really just trying to understand what is happening in our systems, and given our experience, what do we think is likely to go wrong, and so let's track that.
And who's responsible for the post-production monitoring? Are the developers who author those features also part of the process for the post-production monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. We're kind of in this weird dual state at the moment where both our development teams are responsible for that, and we have an operations team that are also responsible for that. So there's a lot of kind of crosswork there at the moment to make sure everyone's getting what they need.
So what's the responsibility boundary between your developer team and your operation team?
Yeah, again, it's a bit fuzzy. Often the operations team are acting as kind of the line of support above us. So often they will be running kind of first and second line support for external customers for other teams outside of hotels and holidays. And then, like, I think our teams could hand off all of our monitoring to that operations team, but I think I think part of being a developer is understanding how your code works in production, and I think if you don't have access to that, you don't grow as well as a developer. So I think there's a desire to keep some of that in house, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that's if you want to go full stack, I think you have to go into the monitoring part of the world. Yeah. One more thing I want to touch on, which is something that we all dread, but something that we have to deal with, which is rollbacks. And so deploying multiple times a day increases the likelihood of encountering issues, statistically. So how do you manage rollbacks in your CD pipeline to ensure quick and safe reversions without disrupting services?
Yeah, mostly we don't. So because we are deploying so often, our general preference is to roll forwards. Obviously, if it's the whole site has gone down, it's like, okay, cool. But our rollback process is, okay, so revert the commit and push, which is, so what would we gain by having kind of a dedicated rollback process? So you're not having to make the commit and you're not having to get a review on the PR. I mean, if it's a P1 issue, then everyone's in the room anyway. So that wait on that PR shouldn't be a problem. The pipeline's going to take the same. I guess you wouldn't have to build the artifact, and you wouldn't. You'd still want to run. Would you want to run tests? Maybe you wouldn't want to run any tests either. So you would get a bit of speed, but then you're adding a bunch of complexity. And so in general, we roll forwards. I have worked with one team that have decided that they do want this rollback ability, and so they've implemented it into their pipeline. But yeah, in general, our strategy is, because we are highly unlikely to do any serious damage because we have small commits, we can just make more small commits.
That's really fascinating. And how do you get the commit size smaller? That's something we have also talked with our previous guests, but we'd love to get your thoughts on what are some best practices to get the commit smaller.
Yeah, so I think this. So we have because we are doing continuous deployment, we have a forwards and backwards compatibility kind of culture. So whenever you make a change, you should never be breaking clients. And so I think it's a developer, it's a slightly weird mindset shift. I liken it to so I started like my programming career in Java and C#, and then I moved to functional programming, and I think this is it. And what I found happened was I would think in object oriented, and then I would write some functional code to do what the object oriented code was doing. And then at some point it switched, and I just thought in functional programming terms. I think it's a bit like, if you learn French and you speak English, what you do is you translate English into the French you need to say. You say the French, and then when you hear French, you translate it back into English. But eventually you get to the point where you just think in French. And so it's really just changing that mindset to be, okay, when I write code, I need to not break stuff. And so can I write a small amount of code that doesn't break anything but does include the change I want, if that makes sense. Well, what's the smallest change I can make? Yeah,
I think this mindset is critical, right? But I think this also depends on individual coding habit and also capability in terms of decomposing the problem into smaller steps.
Absolutely.
Is there any, like on the team level, for example, like practice like feature flags, like some other similar practices that can help you guys get the commit or pull request size?
Yeah, so we are using feature flags, but I think we're using it more in a release versus deployment kind of way. So the idea being that you put some feature flags up that allows you to continuously deploy but not change the functionality of the system. And then when you want to release that change, you can then switch to feature flag, which I think is a slightly kind of higher level thing than what we were just talking about. So we tend not to use feature flags for small changes. Like we might gate a bunch of smaller changes behind a feature flag. But I think, it is just trying to change that mindset. And I think TDD helps, or similar ideas help. So I work in Clojure. We work with REPLs. We tend not to do so much TDD, but the idea is the same. Is what you're trying to do is create a single small encapsulated change, because that's the thing, right? If you're doing TDD, so you ask how can you make your commit smaller? Well, if you're doing TDD, then just commit every time you go green.
Makes sense. Is there I guess this is not like the key here, but out of curiosity, is there a TDD framework that you guys love and recommend?
No, again, so we've got different teams. So we've got a couple of Clojure teams, we've got a Ruby team, we've got front end teams, mostly in next, maybe. And so there isn't any one particular framework. And again, I think
What do you use
so
yourself?
I just use
Your team.
I'm mostly a Clojure engineer. So I tend to work in Clojure. We don't really do TDD. We get the same benefit from basically working in a REPL. So we're live coding the entire time. But if I'm writing tests, then there have been a bunch of different kind of test frameworks for Clojure, and I've ended up just going back to the one that comes with the language. Because again, it's about the simplification. Like a lot of what I've discovered or what I found was that a lot of testing frameworks were trying to solve for complexity. So I wanted to do this really complex thing, and it would allow me to do that complex thing more easily. But actually, what I wanted to do was not do the complex thing. I wanted to decompose it into more simple things.
Makes sense. Great. So I want to switch gear here and then ask a question about the hype topic that everyone is talking about these days, which is AI. So I was wondering if your team is leveraging AI tools in your software engineering processes. If so, what kind of AI tooling are you guys using, and what results have you seen from their application?
Yeah. So the short answer is no. So because a lot of the AI tooling actually kind of takes the data, takes your code while you're using it. That's not that's frowned upon by the organization. We don't want our code and our data just being released into the wild, and so we're doing some. The wider organization is doing some very controlled experiments with AI tooling. I'm not sure if we've started with developer tooling yet. We're definitely doing some of the more general kind of Office suite AI tooling. But yeah, we're looking at it. We haven't got there yet. We'll see how it goes.
Where do you guys host your code?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. So it's on GitHub.
And do you guys use GitHub Copilot?
No. As far as certainly I'm not aware of anyone using GitHub Code.
Is it that the management doesn't believe that the Copilot would provide a 20 to 30% productivity gain?
I think it's that the risks are currently unknown, and so we want to better understand the risks.
The risk and security is still the top
absolutely.
concern in adopting AI tooling. Got it.
Yeah, and so while our code is kept on GitHub, like we store our own data. Right. That's the more dangerous. I think that's probably the more dangerous thing is that if our data ends up getting leaked, that's very
got it. Cool. And that wraps up our formal questions. But I do have several rapid fire questions for you.
Yeah, go for it.
Ready. Okay. What's your favorite development tool that you cannot leave out?
IntelliJ with the Vim plugin.
Okay. So you're a Vim guy.
I'm half a Vim guy.
What do you mean by half of a Vim guy?
I like the motions, but everything else I haven't ever managed to get my head around. So buffers and nerd trees and all of that chaos. Yeah, no, I still like my big clunky IDE because if I need to go and find stuff, I can just do a search.
Got it. So IntelliJ Vim hybrid. Awesome. Second question. Can you recommend a recent book or blog that you came across and found great?
I mean, it's not recent, but if you haven't read it, read Accelerate. It's phenomenal. I think it should. In my opinion, it's the blueprint of how every software team should be built. More recent than that, quite like Dave Farley's continuous delivery YouTube channel. I think that's pretty good. And I'm currently working through Code That Fits in Your Head by Mark Seaman.
I feel like we need to make a rule that people cannot, recommend Accelerate. It's such a highly regarded book in our community. Everyone comes up and they recommend Accelerate.
We're just going to assume that one.
Yeah, we're going to assume that one. Last one. If you could only code in one language for the rest of your career, which one would
the moment it'd be Clojure.
Clojure.
I'm part of the cult of Rich Hickey.
Great. Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, Hugh. Great to have you on the show. We'd love to continue the conversation at a later episode.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks very much for having me on. It's been fun.